Well, hi everyone. I hope you have been challenged in this series, and I hope you've been encouraged in this series as well. I know for myself, I've been challenged, and honestly, I've been challenged with a very basic part of this teaching series we're in, and it's with a simple truth, and that is you can't love your neighbor if you don't really know your neighbor. And I know that is so basic. So just keep that between us, right? Circle of trust, don't judge me for that. But over the course of my life, I haven't really known my neighbors that well, and therefore I haven't really loved them that well. Well, we are wrapping up our series, and so I thought it'd be good for us to just kind of go over some basic tips and how we can love our neighbors well. And the first tip is we have to embrace the mess. That's right, we have to embrace the mess. You know, if we lived in a perfect world, then we would never disagree with our neighbors. We would always get along with them, but we don't live in a perfect world. And sometimes our neighbors, they can annoy us, and sometimes they can frustrate us. You know, maybe you've had a neighbor who had a dog, and the dog would bark all night long and all day, and your neighbor didn't seem to care. Maybe they didn't even do anything to stop the problem. Or maybe you had a neighbor that had a tree that would hang over your property and would dump leaves and pine needles all over your backyard, and it would ruin your lawn. And maybe they didn't do a thing to help with that. Well, I had a neighbor who annoyed me, who frustrated me. And again, we're in the circle of trust here, so don't judge me for this, but this particular neighbor had at least 5 cars parked in front of their house. Now, I know what you're probably thinking. That's a lot of cars, but why did that annoy you so much? Well, they always had at least one car parked in front of our house. Now, to be fair, they didn't park directly in front of our house. They parked a little bit to the side, in between our house and our neighbor's house. But they did this every single night. They did this every single night when they had multiple places right in front of their house that they could have parked their car. And to make it worse, they never parked in their own driveway. And they did this for months and months and months. And so I started to grow in my frustration. And so whenever I had the chance on trash night, I would take out my trash cans and I would purposely put them right where they would always park. And they didn't seem to get the message. They would just park a few feet behind it and leave their car there. Well, I got more and more annoyed with this, and it got to the point where on a Friday, and I'm not proud to admit this, but on a Friday night after work, I drove my car home and I parked it right in front of their house. I parked it right in the spot where the path goes from the sidewalk all the way up to the front door. I parked it right there, and I left my car there for 2 whole days. I know. It was so passive aggressive, it was not mature, and it was definitely not pastoral. But you know what? They stopped parking in front of my house. They got the message, but it wasn't okay. It wasn't the right thing to do. It wasn't the right thing to do at all. In fact, we see in Romans chapter 12, the Apostle Paul writes, "If it's possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone." You see, I look back at that moment and I cringe thinking about how I handled that with my neighbors. You see, before it became that big of a problem, I should have had a conversation with them. But before that, I should have invested more in that relationship, in that friendship. Now, to be fair to myself, just so you don't think I'm a complete loser as a pastor, this was a very introverted family. They were very shy. I'd be doing yard work in front of the house, and they would come out, and I would try to engage with them. I'd say, "Hey, how's it going? How you doing?" And I'd be lucky if I got a wave. Many times they wouldn't even make eye contact, and they would get in their car, and they would drive away. Well, after several attempts of this, I kind of gave up. I kind of stopped talking to them. And that wasn't the best way to handle that situation. Well, Jesus, he takes this even a step further. In Matthew chapter 5, Jesus says, "You have heard it said, love your neighbor and hate your enemies. But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you." You see, Jesus takes this a huge step further. And he tells us we should love our neighbors even if they annoy us, even if they frustrate us. You see, if it's possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with your neighbors. And if our neighbors annoy us and frustrate us, we need to learn how to forgive them. We need to learn how to forgive them because we have been forgiven. Now, why would we choose to live that way? Well, remember how this series started. We talked about the greatest commandment of all. We're to love God with everything that we have, and we're to love our neighbors as we love ourselves. Now, the other way that we can embrace the mess is that we have to be okay with receiving from others. Now, at first, they may not seem like a real big deal. And receiving from others, how is that embracing the mess? But if we're really honest with ourselves, for a lot of us, we don't like to put ourselves in a place where we might feel like we're imposing on our neighbors. We might want to feel like, hey, we don't need anything from our neighbors. And if we're not careful, one of the greatest temptations in loving our neighbors well is that we can think that we need to put on our super neighbor cape, where we're just going to meet their needs all the time, and we're never going to allow them to meet our needs or to help us out. And we could live that way, but if we're not careful, those relationships over time will probably be pretty empty. They probably won't be very dynamic, and they probably won't go very far if it's very one-sided. You see, one time I had this neighbor, and he was a construction worker, and I had bought these really cheap metal shelves on Craigslist. I got them like dirt cheap. And I have to admit, I am not a handy guy at all. Like, I'm not handy in the slightest. And I was trying to put these shelves together, and my neighbor must have heard my frustration. He must have seen it, because not too long after, he came over and he said, hey, can I help you? And at first I was like, no, I got this. I'll eventually figure it out. But he insisted on helping. And I said, okay, you know what? I really could use your help, because you could probably figure this out in like a minute, and it's probably going to take me hours to figure this out. And sure enough, he discovered that the little plastic parts to the shelving were not the right ones to make the shelf work. And so he brought over his drill gun and he screwed the shelves to the poles, and it was done in like a minute. And this would have taken me literally hours to figure out. It took me one time 3 days to put together a portable basketball hoop. And within 2 minutes, he had the shelves up in my garage and saved me all this time. And from that point forward, my friendship with that neighbor was so much better. It was so much more organic and life-giving and so much more natural, because he got to see the real me. He got to see that I'm not handy, that I'm actually not confident in doing things like that at all. And he got to help me out. And from that point forward, our connection, our friendship, our relationship was so much better. But I had to be willing to receive help from him. And what's interesting is even with Jesus, we see that he was willing to receive help from others. God incarnate, God in the flesh, was willing to receive help from others. In Luke chapter 7, we see that Jesus was okay with receiving worship and praise from what the scriptures refer to as a sinful woman. She goes to this dinner party that Jesus is at. She sees Jesus, and she's overcome in this moment, and she begins to cry and weep at Jesus' feet. Her tears fall from her face onto Jesus' feet. She takes her hair and she wipes the tears with her hair, and then she takes this expensive perfume and she pours it on Jesus' feet. This is a very vulnerable moment for Jesus, because he's having dinner with these religious leaders who despise this woman. And they would have loved to have gone public and say, he messed up, he let this sinful woman touch him, and yet Jesus receives this worship and this praise from this woman. And that's not the only place we see this in Scripture. Jesus had a group of women that would travel with him, and many of them would provide for the financial and physical needs of Jesus and the disciples. Jesus, who came to give everything for us, was willing to receive from us. And so we have to be willing to receive from our neighbors. Another way that we embrace the mess is that occasionally we're going to have to establish some boundaries. This won't happen all the time, but as we get to know our neighbors, there will come moments where we have to kind of figure out what's a boundary that we need to set place here. Now, this can be confusing. Sometimes we're not going to know. And so the best way to unpack this, the best way to explain this is that you are responsible to your neighbors, but you're not responsible for your neighbor. So for example, you are responsible to love your neighbor, to serve your neighbor, to encourage your neighbor, to be a good neighbor, but you're not responsible for your neighbor. You're not responsible for their happiness. You're not responsible for their well-being. You're not responsible for their success or failures in life. You're not responsible for the marital strength of their relationship. You're not responsible for their overall well-being. But this is where it can get tricky, because sometimes we're not sure what to do. Sometimes we might get to know our neighbor over time when we realize that they need some help. Well, the key for us is when you're not sure what to do, you just ask God for wisdom. And if it's still not clear, then you ask a trusted friend or someone you look up to who's filled with grace and truth, and you ask for their input as well. And God will make it clear to you. And when it's clear, you go in the confidence that God has given you what you need to love your neighbor well. And remember, God doesn't expect you to do everything, but he does expect you to do something, which is better than doing nothing. Well, that kind of wraps up our tips for this series, but we're also wrapping up this series as well. And so I think it'd be good for us to remind ourselves what we've covered so far. We talked about how we are to love our neighbors well. But for many of us, the problem is we don't know our neighbors that well. And so the first step for many of us is just to know our neighbors, to get to know them, to spend time hearing their story and learning about their life. But we also have to acknowledge that we might have some fear. We might have some fear that kind of keeps us from really getting to know our neighbors. And that's okay, because the majority of us struggle with this, but we're not going to stay there. We're going to push ourselves out of our comfort zone to get to know our neighbors. And we have to keep in mind that we weren't put on that street or in that apartment complex or in that dorm by accident. We were put there on purpose with a purpose. And our interactions with our neighbors are actually a divine appointment established by God. And we also talked about how we are to be salt and light here on the earth, that God wants us to reach our neighbors. And over time, as we stay committed to this, we will move from strangers to acquaintances to having a real relationship and friendship with our neighbors. And God will use that in a powerful, incredible way. And lastly, I want to leave you with this thought. Imagine what it would be like in the East Bay if people all over the East Bay that call Cornerstone home all took their next step in loving their neighbor. Imagine how many incredible, powerful moments God could work with if every single one of us said, Lord, I'm going to take my next step in loving my neighbor. Love you guys. Talk to you later.